A wealthy rancher who believed success came only to those who earned it. A cook who worked from dawn till midnight, never complaining, never asking for help. But when he discovered where she laid her head each night in the cold, hast-strewn corner of his own barn with two small children huddled beside her, everything he thought he knew about hard work, dignity, and survival came crashing down. Because sometimes the people who work the hardest are the ones struggling the most. And what he did next would change not just her life, but the way he saw every soul who worked his land. But before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. No shortcuts, just relentless work, smart decisions, and an iron will that refused to break. Even when the winters were brutal and the cattle market crashed, the ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of Wyoming territory, its boundaries marked by wooden fences that stretched toward horizons most men would never see. He employed over 40 hands, ran 2,000 head of cattle, and his name carried weight in Silver Creek and beyond. Henry believed in one thing above all else: you reap what you sow, work hard, get paid fair, slack off, and the door's right there. He didn't tolerate laziness, didn't hand out charity, and didn't concern himself with what his workers did after the dinner bell rang. That was their business. His business was keeping the ranch running like a well-oiled machine, and for years, that philosophy had served him well until the night everything changed. It was late October 1883. The air had turned sharp, carrying the first real bite of winter. Henry had been working in his office, a small room off the main house, where he kept his ledgers, maps, and the bottle of whiskey he only touched when the numbers didn't add up. The ranch had quieted down for the night. The hands had retreated to the bunkhouse. The horses were settled in the stables, and the main house stood silent, except for the creak of old wood settling in the cold. Henry rose from his desk, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He'd been at it for hours, reviewing supply orders and calculating what they'd need to get through the winter. As he moved toward the window to close the shutters, something caught his eye: a flicker of movement near the barn. He paused, squinting into the darkness. The barn doors were supposed to be closed and locked by now. Dutch Calloway, his foreman, made sure of it. Every night, without fail. But there, in the pale moonlight, he saw a figure slipping through the side entrance. Small, quick, trying not to be noticed. Henry's jaw tightened. Thieves weren't uncommon out here. Rustlers, drifters, looking for an easy score. It happened. He grabbed his coat and hat, stepping out into the cold night air. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he made his way toward the barn, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his hip. But as he drew closer, he realized something was off. The figure wasn't moving like a thief. There was no urgency, no looking over the shoulder, just exhaustion. Henry slowed his steps, staying in the shadows as he approached the barn. He eased the door open just enough to peer inside. What he saw stopped him cold. Clara Bennett, his cook. She stood in the dim light of a single lantern, her shoulders slumped, her movement slow and deliberate. Clara had been working at the Double H for nearly 6 months now. She was quiet, efficient, never caused trouble. She cooked 3 meals a day for the entire ranch, kept the kitchen spotless, and somehow always had fresh bread ready by sunrise. Henry paid her a fair wage, more than most cooks earned on other ranches. She should have been able to afford a room in town, maybe even a small house. So, why was she here? Clara knelt down near a pile of hay in the corner, and that's when Henry saw them. 2 small faces peeking out from beneath a worn blanket. Children. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, with tangled brown hair and wide, watchful eyes. A boy, younger, clutching a wooden toy horse that looked like it had been carved by hand. They didn't speak. They just watched their mother with the kind of quiet understanding that no child should have to carry. Clara reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out 2 biscuits. Leftovers from the evening meal, Henry realized. She handed one to each child, her voice soft, barely audible. Eat slow. Make it last. Henry's chest tightened. She wasn't stealing, she was surviving. And she'd been doing it right under his nose. Henry stood frozen in the shadows, his hands still resting on the barn door. Every instinct told him to step inside, to demand answers, to ask Clara why in God's name she was living in his barn with 2 children when he paid her decent wages. But something held him back. A gnawing feeling in his gut that told him there was more to this story than he could see from where he stood. He watched as Clara tucked the blanket around her children, smoothing her daughter's hair with a tenderness that made his throat tight. The little girl whispered something Henry couldn't hear, and Clara shook her head gently, pressing a finger to her lips. The boy had already curled up, clutching his wooden horse, his eyes heavy with sleep. Clara didn't lie down beside them. Instead, she sat with her back against the barn wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. She looked hollowed out, not just tired, defeated, like she'd been carrying a weight so heavy for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Henry backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. His mind raced. He'd seen Clara every single day for months. She arrived before dawn, stayed until after dark, worked without complaint. She smiled when spoken to, kept to herself otherwise. He'd never once thought to ask where she went after her work was done. Never thought to wonder if she had family, if she had a home, if she was all right. Why would he? She did her job. That was all that mattered. Except now, standing in the cold Wyoming night with frost biting at his face, Henry realized how little he actually knew about the people who kept his ranch running. He knew their names, their work ethic, whether they showed up on time, but their lives, their struggles. He'd never asked, never cared to. He made his way back to the main house, but sleep didn't come easy. He sat in his office, staring at the ledgers in front of him, but the numbers blurred into meaningless lines. All he could see was Clara's face, the exhaustion, the quiet resignation, the way she'd divided 2 biscuits between her children and kept nothing for herself. By the time the sun began to rise, Henry had made a decision. He needed to know the truth, not just about Clara, but about all of it. How had this happened? How had a woman working on his ranch, earning wages he considered fair, ended up sleeping in a barn with her children? What was he missing? Henry rose from his chair and stepped outside. The ranch was already coming to life. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimney. The hands were starting their morning routines, feeding the horses, checking the livestock, and from the kitchen window of the main house, he could see the warm glow of lamplight. Clara was already at work. He walked across the yard, his boots crunching against the frosted ground, and pushed open the kitchen door. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon hit him immediately. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, her movements practiced and efficient. She didn't turn around. "Morning, Mr. Hollister," she said quietly. "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes." Henry stood in the doorway, studying her. She wore the same dress she'd had on last night, though she'd smoothed it out as best she could. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she flipped the bacon. "Clara," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She stiffened just barely but didn't turn around. "Yes, sir." Henry hesitated. He could ask her right now, demand to know why she was living in his barn, why she hadn't said anything, why she was struggling when he paid her good money. But something told him that wouldn't get him the truth. Not the whole truth, anyway. "Never mind," he said finally. "Just wanted to let you know I'll be riding out to check the north pastures today. Won't be back till evening." "Yes, sir." Henry turned and walked out, but he wasn't going to the north pastures. He was going to find out everything. Henry didn't go far. He circled back around the main house, staying out of sight, and positioned himself near the equipment shed where he had a clear view of the kitchen entrance. He felt ridiculous. A grown man, a ranch owner hiding behind his own buildings like some kind of spy. But he needed to see this for himself, needed to understand what he'd missed. The morning passed slowly. Clara moved in and out of the kitchen, carrying plates to the dining hall where the ranch hands ate, refilling coffee pots, clearing dishes. She never stopped moving, never sat down, never took a break, even when the last hand had finished eating and wandered off to start the day's work. Around mid-morning, Dutch Calloway emerged from the barn, leading a horse toward the corral. Henry watched as Clara stepped outside, a bucket in her hand, heading toward the well. Dutch tipped his hat to her as they passed, and Henry noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. The way Dutch's eyes followed her, concern etched across his weathered face. Henry stepped out from his hiding spot and intercepted his foreman near the corral. "Dutch," he said, keeping his voice low. "Got a question for you." Dutch turned, surprised to see Henry there when he'd said he was riding out. "Boss, thought you were headed north. Change of plans." Henry glanced toward the well where Clara was drawing water. "How long have you known?" Dutch's expression shifted. Guilt, resignation, something in between. He didn't ask what Henry meant. He knew. "About 2 months, I reckon," Dutch admitted, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "Found her and the young'uns one night when I was doing a final check of the barn. She begged me not to say nothing. Said she'd leave if I told you." Henry's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think I should know? Wasn't my place to tell, boss." Dutch met his eyes squarely. "She's a good woman. Works harder than any 3 men I know. Whatever's got her living in that barn, it ain't laziness or poor character. Figured she had her reasons." "What reasons?" Henry demanded. "I pay her decent wages. She should be able to afford a room in town at least." Dutch shook his head slowly. "Money ain't always the problem, Henry. Sometimes it's what takes the money away that matters." Before Henry could press further, Clara emerged from the kitchen again, this time carrying a basket toward the small vegetable garden behind the house. Henry watched her go, then turned back to Dutch. "I'm going into town," Henry said. "Find out what I can." Dutch nodded. "Might want to start with Dr. Peterson, or the general store. Mrs. Abernay knows everyone's business." Henry saddled his horse and rode into Silver Creek. The town was small, one main street with a handful of buildings, the general store, the saloon, the doctor's office, the bank, and the church. He'd built much of his wealth here, knew most of the faces, conducted business with the shopkeepers regularly. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. Martha Abernathy stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Hollister, what brings you to town on a weekday?" "Morning, Martha." Henry removed his hat. "Got a question for you. Clara Bennett. She works as my cook. You know her?" Martha's expression shifted, something sad crossing her features. "Oh, Clara. Yes, I know her. Sweet woman. Terrible circumstances." "What circumstances?" Martha leaned forward, lowering her voice even though they were alone. "Her husband died about a year ago. Samuel Bennett worked at the lumber mill until a log broke loose and crushed him. Left her with 2 little ones and a mountain of debt. The company didn't pay out nothing for his death and the medical bills from trying to save him." She shook her head. "Poor thing's been working herself to the bone trying to pay it off." Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How much debt?" "Last I heard? Near about $300, maybe more. $300. For most people in Silver Creek, that might as well have been $3,000. Henry's hands tightened on his hat. "She ever asked for help?" Martha's expression turned pitying. "Mr. Hollister, women like Clara don't ask. They just survive." Henry left the general store with more questions than answers. $300 in debt, a dead husband, 2 children, and yet Clara had never said a word, never asked for an advance on her wages, never let on that she was drowning. He made one more stop. Doc Peterson's office, a small building at the end of Main Street. The doctor was an older man, gay-haired and kind-eyed, the type who delivered half the babies in Silver Creek and tended to just about every injury and illness the town had seen. "Henry Hollister," Doc Peterson said, looking up from his desk. "Don't tell me you're finally here for that checkup I've been after you about." "Not today, Doc." Henry closed the door behind him. "I'm here about Clara Bennett." The doctor's expression sobered immediately. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "What about her? I want to know what happened. Her husband's death, the medical bills, all of it." Doc Peterson sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Henry, that's between me and my patient. She's living in my barn, Doc." Henry's voice was quiet but firm, with her 2 children sleeping on hay, eating table scraps. "I need to know what I'm dealing with here." The doctor's eyes widened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a ledger. He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. "Samuel Bennett was brought to me in September of last year," Doc said quietly. "Lumber accident, internal bleeding, broken ribs, collapsed lung. I did everything I could, but he trailed off, shaking his head. He lasted 3 days. The whole time Clara never left his side, and when he died, she was left with a bill for $75. $75? Henry frowned. "Martha said 300. "That was just my bill," Doc said. "There was the undertaker, the burial plot, the reverend's fee. And then there were the debts Samuel had already accumulated, tools he'd bought on credit, a loan he'd taken to fix their roof before winter. Clara inherited all of it. The lumber company offered her nothing, no compensation, no pension, said Samuel knew the risks when he took the job. Henry's hands clenched into fists, so she's been working herself to death trying to pay it all back. She sold everything they owned," Doc continued. "Furniture, household goods, even her wedding ring, but it wasn't enough. The landlord evicted her when she couldn't make rent. That was about 4 months ago. I don't know where she went after that." He paused, his voice dropping. "Until now, I guess." Henry felt the weight of it settle over him like a heavy blanket. 4 months. Clara had been living in his barn for 4 months, and he never noticed, never asked, never cared enough to look beyond the meals she cooked and the kitchen she kept clean. He thanked the doctor and walked back outside, but he didn't mount his horse. Instead, he stood on the wooden sidewalk, staring down the empty street, his mind churning. $300. It was nothing to him. He could write a check right now, clear her debts, set her up in a proper home. But something told him it wasn't that simple. Clara had pride. He could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she worked without complaint. If he just threw money at her, she'd likely refuse, or worse, she'd take it and disappear, too ashamed to stay. This required a different approach. Henry rode back to the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The temperature was dropping fast, and he thought about Clara and her children, spending another night in that barn, huddled together for warmth, rationing biscuits like they were gold. Not tonight. When he arrived back at the Double H, he didn't go to his office. He didn't check on the cattle or talk to the hands. Instead, he went straight to the barn. Clara was there just as he knew she would be, settling her children down for the night. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening in alarm. "Mr. Hollister, we need to talk, Clara," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I mean right now." Clara stood quickly, instinctively stepping between Henry and her children. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her apron. The little girl, Sadie, Henry had learned her name was, clutched her brother Thomas close, both of them watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't send us away. Not tonight. It's too cold. Just give me till morning and we'll be gone. I promise you won't." "I'm not sending you away," Henry interrupted, his tone softer than he intended. Clara blinked, confusion crossing her face. You're not? No. Henry removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. But I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Why are you living in my barn, Clara? Why didn't you say something? She looked down, her shoulders sagging. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Behind her, Thomas had started to cry softly, and Sadie was trying to shush him, her own eyes brimming with tears. I didn't want to be a burden, Clara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. You gave me a job when no one else would. You pay me fair wages. I didn't want you to think I was ungrateful, or that I couldn't handle my responsibilities. Clara, you're sleeping in a barn. I know, her voice cracked, but it's better than the streets. And I thought if I could just keep working, keep saving, maybe in a few months I could afford a room somewhere, maybe even a small house if I was careful. Henry's chest tightened. I went into town today, talked to Martha Abernathy, Doc Peterson. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes filling with panic. You had no right. I had every right, Henry said firmly, but not unkindly. You're working on my ranch, living on my property, and I didn't even know you were in trouble. That's on me, Clara, not you. Tears spilled down her cheeks now, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to compose herself. I didn't want charity. I still don't. This isn't charity. Henry took a step closer. I know about Samuel, about the accident, the debts, all of it, and I know you've been working yourself half to death trying to dig out of a hole that wasn't your fault to begin with. Clara's lip trembled. He was a good man, Mr. Hollister. Samuel worked hard. He provided for us, but when he died, she closed her eyes, her voice breaking. The lumber company didn't care. The bank didn't care. Everyone just wanted their money, and I had nothing left to give except myself. So I worked. I took every job I could find. Washing clothes, mending fences, cleaning houses. And when you offered me this position, I thought maybe finally things would get better. But they didn't. No. She shook her head, her voice hollow. Because no matter how much I make, it's never enough. The interest keeps piling up, the debts keep growing. And my babies. Her voice broke completely now, and she covered her face with her hands. My babies are hungry, Mr. Hollister. They're cold, and I can't give them what they need. Henry felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd built an empire on the belief that hard work was all it took, that if you put in the effort, success would follow. But standing here watching a woman who'd worked harder than most men he knew break down because the world had beaten her into the ground, he realized how wrong he'd been. Hard work wasn't always enough. Not when the deck was stacked against you. Not when one tragedy could wipe out everything you'd built. How much do you owe? Henry asked quietly. Claire looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. About $300, maybe more with the interest. Henry nodded slowly. And if that debt was gone? What then? Clara stared at him, not daring to hope. I don't understand. If I paid it off, all of it, what would you need to get back on your feet? Mr. Hollister, I can't answer the question, Clara. She hesitated, then whispered, a place to live, somewhere safe for my children. Henry put his hat back on. Then that's what you'll have. Clara stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Mr. Hollister, I can't accept. You're not accepting charity, Henry said, his voice firm. You're accepting what should have been yours from the start. Fair compensation, a decent place to live, the ability to raise your children without sleeping in a barn. He paused, his jaw set. And you're going to let me do this, Clara, because if you don't, I'll spend every night from here on out knowing I had the power to help, and didn't, and I won't be able to live with that. Clara's hands shook as she pressed them to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Sadie had wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, and Thomas peeked out from behind his sister, his eyes still wide and uncertain. I don't know what to say, Clara whispered. Don't say anything yet. Henry turned toward the barn door. Just pack up whatever you have. You and your children are sleeping in the main house tonight. There's a guest room. Hasn't been used in years, but it's warm and it's got real beds. Tomorrow morning we'll figure out the rest. He didn't wait for her response. He walked out into the cold night air, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was bigger than that. If one of his workers, someone he saw every single day, could fall through the cracks this badly, how many others were struggling in silence? Henry made his way to the bunkhouse and found Dutch sitting by the fire, mending a bridle. The foreman looked up as Henry entered. "Need to talk," Henry said. Dutch set the bridle aside and stood. "What's on your mind, boss? I want you to ask around quietly. Find out if any of the other hands are having trouble making ends meet. Medical bills, family problems, debts they can't shake. I don't care what it is. I want to know." Dutch's eyebrows rose. "You planning on fixing everyone's problems now? I'm planning on making sure no one else is sleeping in my damn barn without me knowing about it." Henry shot back. Then he softened. "Look, I've spent years thinking that if I paid fair wages, that was enough. But it's not. Life happens, accidents happen, and if the people working this ranch can't survive on what I'm paying them, then I'm not paying them enough." Dutch studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll see what I can find out. And Dutch, I need you to ride into town tomorrow. Talk to Maggie Stone. Tell her I need to see her out here as soon as possible. We're going to go over every expense, every wage, every policy we've got. I want to know where we can make changes." "You sure about this, Henry?" Dutch asked carefully. "The other ranchers hear you're raising wages and offering help for personal troubles. They're going to think you've gone soft. Might try to poach your best workers with promises of easier conditions. Let them try." Henry's voice was still. "If I'm doing right by my people, they won't have reason to leave. And if other ranchers want to follow suit and treat their workers better than good, maybe this whole territory could use a shakeup." Dutch grinned, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day Henry Hollister went from hard ass to bleeding heart." "I'm not a bleeding heart," Henry said, though there was no heat in it. "I'm a businessman, and keeping good workers happy is good business. I just should have figured that out sooner." The next morning, Henry was up before dawn. He'd spent half the night working through numbers, trying to figure out what he could realistically offer without bankrupting the ranch. It wouldn't be easy. There'd be pushback from some of the investors, the cattle buyers, maybe even some of the senior hands who'd been around long enough to get comfortable with the way things were. But Henry didn't care. By the time the sun rose, Clara and her children were asleep in the guest room, warm and safe for the first time in months. And Maggie Stone was riding toward the ranch, saddlebags full of ledgers and a sharp mind ready to help him figure out how to change everything. This was just the beginning. 3 days later, Henry gathered everyone who mattered in the main dining hall of the Double H Ranch. The long wooden table that usually served meals to the ranch hands now held stacks of papers, ledgers, and financial reports. Seated around it were the people whose opinions and money kept the ranch running. Samuel Wright, a cattle investor from Cheyenne, who'd bankrolled Henry's expansion 5 years ago. Eleanor Price, an older widow who owned land adjoining the Double H and had invested heavily in Henry's operation, and 2 other senior stakeholders who'd made fortunes in cattle, land, and railroads. Maggie Stone sat to Henry's right, her sharp eyes scanning the room, a pen poised over her notebook. Dutch stood near the door, arms crossed, watching quietly. Samuel Wright leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit looking out of place in the rustic dining hall. "All right, Henry, you called this meeting. What's so urgent it couldn't wait till spring?" Henry stood, his hands resting on the table. "I'm making changes to how this ranch operates." "Effective immediately." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes?" "Wage increases across the board," Henry said evenly. 10% for all ranch hands, 15 for those who've been here more than 2 years. I'm also setting up an emergency fund, money set aside to help workers dealing with medical bills, family crises, or debts they can't manage on their own. The room fell silent. Then Samuel laughed, a short, incredulous bark. You're joking. I'm not. Henry, we run a cattle ranch, not a charity house. Samuel shook his head, his expression hardening. You start handing out raises and playing banker for every soba story that comes your way, you'll bleed this operation dry within a year. No, I won't, Henry said calmly. Maggie's run the numbers. We can afford it. Maggie spoke up, her voice crisp and professional. Our biggest expense isn't wages, it's turnover. We lose workers constantly because they can't make ends meet. So they leave for opportunities in the railroads, the mines, or other ranches that promise better conditions. Every time we lose a hand, we spend time and money training a replacement who might not last 6 months. If we invest in the people we have now, we keep them longer. That saves us money in the long run. Samuel scoffed. That's a pretty theory, Miss Stone. But the reality is that coddling workers makes them lazy. You give a man too much, he stops working hard. That's not what I've seen, Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. I've got a cook who works 16-hour days, raises 2 children alone, and never once complained or asked for help, even when she was sleeping in my barn because she couldn't afford anything else. You call that lazy? Eleanor's eyes widened. Someone's been living in your barn for 4 months, Henry said, and I didn't know because I was too busy believing that if I paid fair wages that was enough. But it's not. Life kicks people down, and sometimes they can't get back up without help. That doesn't make them weak. It makes them human. Eleanor studied him carefully, then looked at Maggie. You really believe this will work? I do, Maggie said without hesitation. The numbers support it, but more than that, it's the right thing to do. Samuel slammed his hand on the table. And what about profits, Henry? What do I tell my partners when our margins shrink because you decided to play savior? Henry leaned forward, his gaze locked on Samuel. You tell them that I'm building something that lasts, a ranch where people want to work, where loyalty matters more than turnover. And if that's not good enough for you, Samuel, I'll buy out your share myself. The room went dead silent. Samuel stared at him, his jaw tight. You're serious completely. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor cleared her throat. I vote yes. Samuel's head snapped toward her. Eleanor, I've seen enough men in this territory work themselves to death for nothing, Eleanor said quietly. If Henry wants to do better, I'll support him. One by one, the others nodded. Samuel stood abruptly, grabbing his hat. You're making a mistake, Hollister. Maybe, Henry said, but it's mine to make. Samuel stormed out. Henry exhaled, the weight lifting from his chest. It was done. The following morning, Henry stood on the porch of the main house, watching as the ranch came to life. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Horses whinnied in the corral. The hands were starting their daily routines, feeding livestock, mending fences, preparing for another long day of work. But today was different. Henry had asked Dutch to gather everyone in front of the main house at sunrise. All 43 ranch hands, the stable workers, the blacksmith, even old Pete, who kept the equipment shed running. They stood now in a loose semicircle, hats and hands, curious expressions on weathered faces. They'd been told this was important, but no one knew why. Clara stood off to the side near the kitchen door, Sadie and Thomas beside her. She'd tried to stay inside, insisted she didn't need to be part of this, but Henry had asked her to come. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting in her apron. Henry stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The murmuring died down as all eyes turned to him. Morning, Henry said, his voice carrying across the yard. A chorus of Morning Boss came back. Henry took a breath. He'd rehearsed this a dozen times in his head, but now that the moment was here, the words felt heavier than he'd expected. "I've been running this ranch for 15 years, he began. Built it from nothing, just like most of you have built your lives from nothing. I've always believed that hard work was the answer to everything, that if a man or woman put in the effort, they'd get what they deserved. And for a long time, I thought that was enough." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. Men who'd worked for him for years. Men who'd never complained, never asked for more than their wages and a dry place to sleep. But I was wrong. That got their attention. A few exchanged confused glances. "Hard work matters," Henry continued, "but it's not always enough. Life throws things at you that no amount of sweat and grit can fix. Accidents, sickness, debts that pile up through no fault of your own. And I've been so focused on running this ranch, on keeping the numbers up and the cattle moving, that I stopped seeing the people who make it all possible." He gestured toward Clara, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. "Some of you know Clara Bennett. She's been cooking your meals for the last 6 months. Works dawn to dark. Never complains. Never asks for help. What you don't know is that she's been living in the barn with her 2 children because she couldn't afford anything else. And I didn't know either because I never asked." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the men looked shocked. Others looked down at their boots, uncomfortable. "That ends today," Henry said firmly. "Effective immediately. Wages are going up. 10% across the board. 15% for anyone who's been here more than 2 years. We're also setting up an emergency fund. If you've got medical bills, family troubles, debts you're drowning in, you come to me or Dutch. We'll figure it out. No one who works this ranch should have to choose between feeding their family and keeping a roof over their heads." The silence that followed was thick, disbelieving. Then one of the older hands, a man named Charlie, who'd been with Henry since the beginning, spoke up. "You mean that, boss?" "Every word," Henry said. Charlie's weathered face broke into a slow smile. "Well, I'll be damned." A few others chuckled, the tension breaking. Henry saw relief in their eyes, gratitude, hope, things he hadn't noticed before because he'd never bothered to look. "This ranch works because of you," Henry said, "all of you, and it's about time I started treating you like you matter because you do." Dutch stepped forward, his voice gruff but warm. "All right, you heard the man. Let's get to work." The hands dispersed, heading to their stations, but Henry noticed something different in the way they moved. Lighter, straighter, like a weight had been lifted. Clara approached him, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Hollister, your cottage will be ready by the end of the week." Henry interrupted gently. "Small place just past the stables. It's yours for as long as you work here." "Rentrez." Clara couldn't speak. She just nodded, clutching her children close. Henry watched them go, and for the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. Not just built wealth, but built something worth keeping. Want to hear more stories like this? Hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below and let